The attack started like something small, the kind of moment most people barely notice. She stepped out of her apartment with a bag of trash in one hand and her phone tucked under her chin. It was late, but not the kind of late that makes you look over your shoulder. The parking lot lights were still on. A dog barked a few buildings over. Someone's TV carried through an open window. Nothing felt dangerous. She'd walked this same stretch hundreds of times. She didn't even see them at first. Two figures in hoodies, lingering near the dumpster. She thought they were teens cutting through the complex, maybe looking for a quiet place to smoke. She kept walking because that's what people do when they don't want to make a scene. She tossed the trash bag, shifted her phone to her hand, and turned back toward her door. That's when she heard the steps behind her. Fast, close, wrong. She spun on instinct, but one of them was already in her space. He shoved her hard enough to knock the phone from her hand. It hit the pavement and lit up with a cracked flash. She stumbled and caught herself on her palms. Gravel dug into her skin. Before she could get up, the second figure kicked her in the ribs. The air punched out of her. She tried to shout, but nothing came. She pushed herself up again, not because she thought she could win, but because freezing felt worse. The first one grabbed her by the jacket and slammed her against the side of a parked car. The metal rattled and woke a car alarm farther down the lot. She felt hands at her pockets and realized they were after her purse or her wallet. It should have been a simple mugging. Take the money, run, disappear into the dark where most crimes stay unsolved. But something shifted. Maybe they recognized her. Maybe they didn't like the way she struggled. Maybe they were wired on something and past the point of logic. The second one grabbed her leg. She kicked back without thinking. Her shoe hit something solid, and the reaction was instant. He dropped her foot, stepped back, and drove his heel into her shin with a force that didn't match the moment. A crack shot through her body, sharp and bright. Her vision fuzzed at the edges. She screamed. That sound carried farther than she expected. A porch light clicked on across the lot. Someone shouted from a balcony. For a second, the attackers froze. She thought they'd run. Instead, the first one cursed, grabbed her other leg, and stomped down at the knee. It folded the wrong way. Pain rushed in so fast it felt unreal, like her body couldn't process it. She didn't recognize her own voice as it broke out of her. She tried to crawl, dragging herself toward the glow of a nearby window, but her limbs wouldn't coordinate. They kept shouting at each other. Their words blurred together, frantic and sloppy. They hadn't planned this. Even she could see that. What happened next had nothing to do with money or robbery. It was fear mixed with anger. It was two people trying to control a situation that had spun out of their hands. One of them kicked her again, this time in the side of her head. The blow didn't knock her out. It just made the world tilt in slow circles. Footsteps started echoing from the stairwells. A woman yelled that she was calling the police. A man shouted something she couldn't make out. The two attackers looked around like animals searching for an escape path, then took off between the buildings, disappearing into the strip of trees behind the dumpsters. Their shoes slapped against the pavement, then faded into the dark. She tried to pull herself up, but her legs refused to move. They weren't just injured. They were separate from her. Her hands shook as she reached toward her phone. It lay cracked a few feet away, screen flickering. She clawed toward it, each inch a fight. The gravel scraped her elbows. Her breath came out in short, broken bursts. Neighbors started gathering, but kept their distance at first. No one wanted to touch her in case they made things worse. Someone kept repeating that the ambulance was on its way. A kid from the next building stood barefoot on the curb, staring like he couldn't look anywhere else. A man kneeled beside her and tried to keep her awake by asking simple questions. Her name, the date, the color of the car she'd been pushed against. She answered some of them. Others drifted past her. All she could focus on was the heat spreading through her legs. It didn't feel like fire. It felt like pressure building in places that had no room left. She tried to move her toes, and nothing happened. The night sounds around her sharpened. Sirens started up in the distance. Someone placed a jacket over her, even though she wasn't cold. Her vision blurred again as the weight of the moment settled on her. The attack had lasted only minutes, but those minutes had rearranged everything she understood about safety, about routine, about the space she thought she controlled. She lay there listening to the approaching sirens, staring at the sky, and trying to keep her eyes open as the pain kept climbing. The neighborhood changed in the minutes after the attackers ran. Word spread faster than the sirens. Windows that had been dark a moment earlier filled with faces. People stepped onto balconies or leaned over railings, each one trying to understand what they'd just heard. Some residents whispered to each other as if volume alone could alter the truth. Others stood still, arms crossed, scanning the lot like they expected the attackers to come back. Fear moves through a place in small, contagious ways. It tightens voices. It pushes people behind locked doors. It makes every shadow feel like it's hiding something. By the time the ambulance pulled in, most of the complex seemed awake. The lights in the courtyard flickered as the power strained from so many units switching on at once. A woman wrapped in a blanket stood at the edge of the sidewalk, rocking back and forth like she was trying to calm someone, maybe herself. A teenager filmed from behind a pillar until an older man put a hand on his phone and shook his head. No one argued with him. The mood didn't allow it. Everyone sensed a line had been crossed, something that didn't fit into the usual noise of parking lot arguments or small-time break-ins. People kept asking the same questions in circles. Who did it? Why they targeted her? If they were still nearby? A few residents insisted they'd seen the attackers before, wandering between buildings, checking car doors, cutting through the property as if they owned it. Others said they hadn't seen anyone at all until they heard her scream. The contradictions only added to the restlessness. It's hard for a community to feel safe when no one agrees on what danger looks like. The officers who arrived tried to take control of the scene, but even they felt the shift in the air. One of them raised his flashlight toward the gap between two buildings where the attackers had escaped. The beam cut through the humid night, catching the movement of branches and nothing else. Residents formed a loose semicircle around the responders, close enough to listen but not close enough to be useful. People kept muttering theories under their breath. Some tried to make sense of the violence by blaming drugs or gangs or strangers who didn't belong there. Others stayed quiet, staring at the blood on the pavement as if calculating how long it would stain. Fear doesn't just come from the act itself. It comes from the realization that it could happen again, that it could happen to anyone. Several parents gathered their kids and walked them back inside without a word. A man who usually spent nights smoking near the stairwell flicked his cigarette away and disappeared inside his apartment like someone had ordered a curfew. The complex felt smaller, tighter, like the walls had drawn in. Every sound seemed louder and wrong. A basketball rolling in the breezeway. A door slamming too fast. The rumble of a car engine across the street. Everyone reacted to each noise with a stiffness they couldn't hide. As the paramedics worked, a few neighbors whispered to each other about what they'd seen. One woman said she recognized the girl's jacket and realized she lived only 2 doors down. She covered her mouth and kept repeating that she'd heard a noise earlier, but didn't think anything of it. A man next to her said he'd been awake the whole time, but assumed the first scream was from someone arguing on the upstairs balcony again. He wouldn't meet anyone's eyes when he said it. Guilt finds its way into places fear has already settled. Even after the sirens faded and the responders left, people didn't go back inside right away. They lingered in clusters, arms folded tight, leaning closer than usual because no one wanted to stand alone. Some tried to lighten the moment with nervous conversation, but every attempt fell flat. The incident had entered that stage where it becomes a story repeated in slightly different versions, each one sharpening the edges of what happened. Someone said the attackers had been armed. Someone else insisted one of them had threatened another resident earlier in the week. None of it was confirmed, but it didn't matter. Scared people hold on to the version that makes sense to them. A patrol car circled the complex twice, slow and deliberate. Each time it passed, more residents retreated inside and locked their doors. Curtains closed. Porch lights clicked off. Even the dog that had barked earlier went silent. The courtyard, usually dotted with people heading to their cars or smoking or walking their pets, emptied out in minutes. The place looked abandoned except for the tape flapping in the wind and the glow of a lone hallway light that refused to shut off. Inside the apartments, Conversations continued through walls thin enough to carry every word. People talked about installing cameras. They talked about asking management for more security. They talked about moving. They talked about whether the attackers lived nearby or were just passing through. The unease settled into the complex like fog, heavy and slow to lift. Even those who didn't know the victim personally felt the impact. Violence close to home always feels personal. It scrapes away the illusion that trouble happened somewhere else. Hours later, long after the flashing lights were gone, someone walked through the courtyard and paused near the blood-stained pavement. They looked around, checked the shadows, then kept moving. The night was quiet, but not the comfortable kind of quiet the complex knew. It was the kind that made people sleep with lights on, listening for footsteps that never came. He got the call just after midnight. He was sitting in the hospital cafeteria with a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold, waiting for clearance paperwork so he could head home for a week. His deployment had ended only days earlier, and he hadn't slept more than a couple of hours at a time. The phone buzzed against the table. He almost ignored it, assuming it was another automated update or someone checking in about his travel plans. When he saw his sister's name on the caller ID, he answered before the second ring. It wasn't her voice on the line. It was a stranger, shaky and unsure, telling him there had been an attack at her apartment complex. For a few seconds, he didn't understand what the person was saying. Words like injured and ambulance hit him in pieces, separated from meaning. When he finally grasped that his sister had been hurt and was being transported to the same hospital he was sitting in, he stood so fast his chair scraped across the floor. He moved through the hallways with a kind of focus that felt automatic. Years of training had carved those instincts into him. When he reached the emergency entrance, he saw the ambulance pulling in. The doors swung open and he caught a glimpse of her on the stretcher, pale and shaking, her legs held in place by splints. For the first time in a long time, he felt something slip inside him. Not panic, not fear. Something deeper, something that came from seeing someone you love hurting in a way that shouldn't be possible. A nurse stepped in front of him, asking if he was family. He nodded once. She tried to explain the process, but he barely heard her. His focus stayed on the stretcher as they rolled her past him. Her eyes fluttered open and she whispered his name. He leaned forward, trying to keep his voice steady, telling her he was right there. She reached for his hand, weak and trembling, and he felt the bones of her fingers under his grip. That's when the damage became real. Her legs weren't just broken. They were broken with intent. Someone had done this deliberately. When they moved her into a treatment room, he waited in the hallway, hands clenched behind his head, pacing in a slow line. A paramedic approached and started explaining what they found at the scene. Fractures in both legs, heavy bruising, signs of blunt force trauma. He listened without interrupting. He asked only one question: if she was going to make it. The paramedic nodded. She would, but recovery would be long and complicated. He nodded back, but his jaw tightened the more details he heard. He kept thinking about her living there alone, carrying groceries up those narrow stairs, calling him with updates about school and work, laughing about small things. It was the normal, everyday picture of her life that hit him the hardest. She wasn't someone who picked fights or took risks. She wasn't someone who made enemies. She was just moving from one part of her day to the next, and then two strangers decided she wouldn't get that luxury anymore. As he waited, people moved around him. Nurses, techs, officers asking basic questions. He answered them mechanically. Where he was when he got the call. How long since he'd last seen her. Whether she had mentioned anything strange recently. He kept trying to replay the last conversation he'd had with her, searching for something he might have missed. A comment. A hint. Nothing came. It was just an ordinary talk about her plans for the week and how she hoped he'd get some real rest once he got home. When the doctors finally let him into her room, he walked in quietly. She lay on the bed, hooked to monitors, her legs wrapped and elevated. Her breathing was slow and uneven. He pulled a chair to her side and sat down. He studied her face for a long moment. The bruise along her cheekbone, the small cuts on her hands, the swelling around her knees. He felt something cold settle in his chest, something steady and unshakable. He'd been in bad places before, seen worse injuries, handled situations where chaos was the default. But this wasn't a mission. This wasn't a stranger in a distant place. This was his sister. She opened her eyes again, groggy and confused. He told her she was safe now. He kept his voice calm because she needed that more than anything. She tried to talk, but the words came out in fragments. He told her not to push it. He stayed in that chair long after she drifted back to sleep, adjusting the blanket, keeping watch the way he'd done for teammates on long nights overseas. Outside the door, officers waited to take a statement when she woke. They had questions, and he had his own. He wanted to know who did it, why they targeted her, how far they got before running. None of those questions had answers yet, but one thing was already settled inside him, clear and unmoving. Whatever had happened out there in that parking lot wasn't finished, and he wasn't going to sit on the sidelines while someone tried to hurt his family. He stayed by her bedside until the sun started pushing through the blinds. The night had been a blur of medical updates, police questions, and the steady beep of the monitor beside her. At first he felt scattered, pulled in every direction, his thoughts running ahead of his ability to process them. But somewhere in those early morning hours, something in him shifted. The shock didn't disappear. It settled, turning into something quieter and more focused. He'd spent enough time in unpredictable places to know the moment when raw emotion gives way to purpose. He watched her sleep, her breathing shallow but steady. The swelling in her legs was worse than it had been hours earlier. The doctors had explained the fractures in careful, clinical terms, but the reality was simple. Someone had tried to destroy her ability to stand. Someone had wanted to take something from her that she could never fully get back. That thought hardened the edges of everything he felt. He leaned back in the chair and let his hands rest on his face. The fluorescent lights buzzing overhead reminded him of deployment nights spent in makeshift medical tents, waiting for updates on injured teammates. He'd learned during those times that shock can only anchor you for so long. Eventually, it breaks apart, and you're left with the choice of what comes next. In those tents, he always chose the same thing. Step forward, deal with the problem, protect what's yours. This moment wasn't any different. The setting had changed, but the instinct hadn't. When a doctor came in to check her vitals, he stepped aside and listened without interrupting. Her condition was stable but fragile. Pain management would be tricky. Surgery was likely. Recovery would require months. The doctor spoke in a calm tone meant to reassure, but each detail added to the slow burn forming in his chest. He nodded through the explanation, asked a few practical questions, and thanked the doctor on their way out. As soon as the door closed, he let the information settle. It didn't soften anything. If anything, it clarified what needed to be done. An officer returned with a small notebook, asking if he remembered anything his sister had said when she first arrived. He tried to run the short exchange back in his mind. She'd whispered his name, reached for his hand, tried to say something about the parking lot. The officer waited, pen ready, but he shook his head. None of it had been clear enough to matter. The officer scribbled a few notes and mentioned they would need to talk to her as soon as she was able. He nodded again, but his thoughts were already elsewhere. He walked into the hallway and found a spot near a window where the early morning light hit the floor in a pale stripe. He stared at it for a long moment, grounding himself in the familiar weight that came before a decision. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't pace. His expression didn't shift. But the people passing by seemed to sense the change in him. The way he stood completely still, shoulders squared, as if waiting for an order only he could hear. He returned to her room and sat again. He kept his movements slow and steady so he wouldn't wake her. He let his mind move through the situation piece by piece. What he knew, what he didn't, what the police would likely focus on, what details might get lost in the system. He'd seen investigations stall before, not from incompetence, but from overload. Too many cases, not enough time, not enough answers. He wasn't angry at the officers. He understood their limits. But he also knew his own. He wasn't built to wait while someone else connected the dots. He thought about the attackers running between the buildings, slipping into the shadows behind the dumpsters. He pictured the layout of the complex the way a tactical diagram unfolds in his mind. Entry points, hiding spots, blind corners, footpaths that don't look like footpaths unless you're paying attention. He'd never even been to her apartment complex, but he could see it anyway. He'd navigated unfamiliar terrain enough times to know how to read spaces without stepping foot in them. As he sat there, the shift that started in the early morning finished settling into place. The confusion he'd felt when he got the call was gone. The disbelief had faded. What remained was a clear sense of direction. He couldn't change what had happened to her. He couldn't undo the pain or the fear. But he could make sure the people who did it didn't get to walk away. He could make sure the next call in the middle of the night would be the last one like this. He looked at her again, the rise and fall of her chest slow but steady. He reached out and adjusted her blanket. His hand lingered there, steadying both of them. Whatever came next, he would handle it. Not out of rage, not out of impulse, but out of the same resolve that had carried him through every hostile night on every deployment. The kind of resolve that didn't waver once it took shape. He waited until she was asleep again before slipping out of the hospital room. The halls were quieter now, filled with the low hum of machines and the soft shuffle of nurses changing shifts. He didn't have a plan yet, not in the detailed sense, but he had the first thread of one. It pulled at him the moment he stepped outside into the early morning air. The sky was still dim, the kind of gray that blurs the edges of buildings. He walked across the parking lot, hands in his pockets, breathing slow and steady. He wasn't rushing. Rushing leads to mistakes. He'd learned long ago that you move slow when you want to see everything. He drove to her apartment complex without telling anyone. The police would come back later for more photographs and statements, but he wanted to see it before the rhythm of the day washed over the scene. He parked in a far corner and took a moment to study the layout. Multiple buildings arranged around a courtyard. A row of dumpsters set against a narrow strip of trees. Stairwells at each corner, shadowed even with the daylight coming in. He stepped out of the car and walked without drawing attention, blending in like someone who simply lived there. The spot where she'd been attacked still had faint traces left behind. A small smear on the pavement. A cracked phone case someone had set aside. The dent in the car door where she'd been shoved was visible even from a distance. He crouched beside it, running 2 fingers lightly over the metal. The cold surface didn't tell him anything new, but the act of touching it brought him closer to understanding the moment. Angles, force, direction. He could reconstruct things in his mind piece by piece, the same way he'd done with scattered intel overseas. He stood and looked around. Attacks like this didn't happen in silence. Someone had heard something. Someone had seen something. People hide fear behind quiet, but quiet doesn't erase memory. He started with the first-floor units facing the lot. He knocked on doors in a calm, measured rhythm. When residents answered, he kept his voice even and gentle, never pushing too fast. He introduced himself as her brother. He didn't mention the SEAL background unless someone asked why he seemed so focused. Most people didn't ask. They recognized something in his posture that made them speak honestly. An older woman on the second door said she heard the scream, louder than anything she'd heard in years. Her hands shook as she talked. She said she saw 2 figures in hoodies running between the buildings. She remembered one of them limped slightly, favoring his right leg. That detail stuck immediately. Injuries change movement patterns. Hard to hide, and even harder to fake. He thanked her and moved on. A man on the 3rd floor said he'd been smoking on his balcony when it happened. He didn't see the beginning but heard the argument escalate into something violent. He saw the attackers sprint toward the trees and vanish behind the dumpsters. When pressed, he said he thought he'd recognized one of them from earlier in the week, someone who'd been checking car doors in the lot late at night. That added a layer. Repeat behavior meant they were comfortable in the area. Comfortable usually meant local. He walked the path the attackers took, stepping through the narrow corridor between 2 buildings. The concrete still held bits of gravel that might have been kicked loose during the chase. He followed the line toward the tree line and paused where the ground shifted from pavement to dirt. Footprints aren't reliable this far after the fact, but he studied the disturbed patches anyway. One was deeper on the right side. A limp could cause that. He cataloged it quietly in his mind. Behind the dumpsters, he found an empty bottle and a torn piece of fabric caught on a nail. He pulled the fabric free, folded it, and slipped it into his pocket. It might mean nothing. It might mean everything. Details gather weight over time. He walked farther into the trees, Not far enough to lose sight of the buildings, but far enough to see where someone might run if they were desperate. A chain-link fence bordered the edge of the complex. A loose section near the bottom had a fresh bend. Someone had pushed through recently. He traced the route back and studied the apartments beyond the fence. Older buildings, less lighting, easier places to disappear. If the attackers lived over there, they wouldn't risk traveling far. People rarely run to unfamiliar ground. They run home or toward places where they think no one pays attention. He returned to the complex and sat in his car, reviewing everything he'd gathered. Movement patterns, physical details, escape routes, possible residences. He replayed each account, sorting what was solid from what was guesswork. It wasn't an investigation by official standards. It was an assessment shaped by discipline and instinct. He wasn't thinking about revenge. He wasn't thinking about making anyone afraid. He was thinking about precision, about understanding who these men were, why they chose her, and where they'd go next. He knew the police were doing their part, but he also knew something they didn't. Targets of random violence sometimes become targets again. Offenders escalate. If these men felt bold enough to break both her legs, they felt bold enough to hurt someone else. He rested his hands on the steering wheel, calm and still. He wasn't done gathering information. This was the first layer. There were more people to talk to, more angles to map, more patterns to uncover. And he would follow each one until the picture was clear. He sat in the car long enough for the sun to climb past the rooftops and spill across the lot. The light didn't soften anything. It only revealed more details, more places the attackers might have moved, more angles he needed to check. He wasn't in a rush, but he also wasn't drifting. Every motion he made had purpose behind it. That was the part most people never understood about men like him. They thought resolve came in loud gestures or clenched fists. For him, it came in quiet focus, the kind that sat just under the surface and shaped every choice. He drove the perimeter of the complex first, slow enough to map every exit and dead end. He looked for habits, cars left in the same spots for days, windows covered with blankets instead of curtains, units with heavy foot traffic at odd hours. Patterns reveal people even when they don't realize they're leaving them behind. He made mental notes of anything that stood out. A sedan with a smashed taillight. A back door with fresh pry marks. A corner building where 3 different faces watched him from behind blinds that barely moved. He parked again and got out, walking the same route the attackers would have taken once they slipped under the bent fence. The neighborhood on the other side was older, a mix of rundown rentals and houses that looked like they hadn't been painted since before he enlisted. He fit in easily by not acting like he was looking for anything. He strolled the sidewalk, hands loose, eyes scanning reflections in windows so he didn't have to turn his head. A man on a porch nodded at him. 2 kids zipped past on bikes. A dog barked from behind a fence, the kind of territorial bark that always betrayed movement it didn't recognize. He followed the street until he reached a strip of small businesses that hadn't opened yet. A laundromat with a flickering sign. A liquor store with its gates still pulled down. A convenience shop where a man was sweeping the sidewalk. He approached at an angle that didn't cut into the man's space and asked calmly if he'd seen 2 guys running through the area the night before. He didn't mention the assault. He didn't need to. People talk more freely when they don't think you're trying to drag them into trouble. The man looked up from his broom and said he heard noise behind the dumpsters around midnight. He saw 2 figures jump the back fence and cut behind the laundromat. He didn't recognize them, but he remembered one of them kept grabbing his own leg like he was in pain. That matched what the older woman in the apartment complex had said about the limp. The detail snapped into place with more weight. He thanked the man and moved on without lingering. He walked behind the laundromat and studied the ground. Trash, old crates, cigarette butts. A few deep scuffs in the dirt near the fence line. One imprint angled oddly, as if the person who made it had shifted weight off an injured limb. He crouched, studying the pressure points. He didn't touch anything. He didn't need to. The picture was building in his mind, clearer with each step. From there he crossed into another alley that fed toward a cluster of rental units with peeling paint and rattling window units. The kind of place where people kept their heads down because trouble was constant enough that it barely registered. A woman leaning on a railing watched him walk past. She didn't look away when he glanced up. Instead, she asked who he was looking for. He told her plainly he was trying to find the men who hurt his sister. Her expression changed. Not sympathy at first. Recognition. People in neighborhoods like this understood violence in a way others didn't. They understood what family drove a person to do. She described two men who matched the rough outline he'd gathered so far. She said they stayed in a unit at the back of the property, coming and going at odd hours. She didn't know their names, but she pointed toward a door with a broken porch light and a stack of delivery flyers shoved into the frame. He nodded once in thanks, and she nodded back as if she already knew what he was there to do. He approached the unit without speeding up, without slowing down. He didn't knock. He listened first. Breathing. Movement. The low hum of a TV left on. He was trained to hear small things, the kinds of sounds most people couldn't pick apart from the noise of a building. Inside, someone shifted their weight, and the floor creaked in a pattern that told him the person was favoring one side. The limp again. The confirmation settled something inside him. He stood there for a moment, shoulders loose, jaw set in a calm line. He wasn't thinking about threats or warnings. He wasn't thinking about what he might have to do once he walked through that door. He wasn't thinking about fear. Men like him didn't frame decisions around fear. They framed them around duty, around lines you don't allow to be crossed when someone you love is hurt. He rested one hand lightly on the doorframe, breathing slow and steady, already calculating what waited on the other side, already prepared for whatever came next.